Hey, and welcome back to another video. So in today's video, we're actually going to do some UI kit.
だが断る。
And in this video, what we're going to do is we're basically going to look at how we can build this form dynamically using different data sources and compositional layout. So let's jump straight into the video. So before we actually start and actually build our dynamic form, I actually want to basically break down how we're actually going to tackle building the models for our form that's going to be basically built off. So essentially, what we're going to do is we're basically going to use a class. So we're basically going to have a form component class that we use, which is going to basically be our base class for all our components. So you may be wondering, why am I using a class and not a protocol or a struct? So essentially, the reason why we're doing this is because when we're working with different data sources, when we're passing in our type within our generic, we're not actually able to apply generic constraint on protocols, or we're not able to actually subclass structs with other structs. So what we're going to do is we're going to basically have a base class called form component, and this is going to basically be our base class that allows us to basically mix and match the different types of components based on inheritance. So if you just look at the components on the screen of what we're going to be working with, so essentially what we have is we have a first name, last name, and an email. And what this is going to be is it's basically going to be one component called a text component. So our text component is actually going to subclass our form component. But when we finish doing that, what we're also going to do is we're going to basically build a date component. And again, the date component is going to subclass our form component as well. And then on top of that, again, we're also going to basically build a button component for our button as well. Now, as you can see, what we're basically doing here is inheritance. So if we want to add a brand new component, let's say for example a picker component, we just have to basically build the model for this and then basically subclass our form component class. So now by doing this, we can basically have a dynamic array of components that all have a similar implementation and basically use this to basically build up our form dynamically, which is what we're going to go through next. Cool. So now that we've broken that down, what I'm actually going to do now is I'm actually going to start to build the model. So the first thing I want to do is I actually want to use, I know we said we're going to use classes, but we're actually also going to use protocols as well. So what we're going to do is we're just going to basically create a new folder here. I'm just going to call it model. And then within here, I'm just going to basically create a brand new file called form model. So let's do that now. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to type out our protocols and I'll actually break this down for you. So I'll just do that now. All right, cool. So what we basically got here is we basically got two protocols. So we basically got one protocol for our form item. Now this is basically the protocol that's going to be used for our class, which is basically be for our base, form component, and it's basically going to get the implementation of a unique identifier with the type UUID. And then what we've basically got here is we basically got our form section item, and what this form section item is basically similar to our form item, except this is for a form section. We're basically going to have another class, which basically is a section that holds an array of items. And you can see here, I've left a comment for some things we'll need to come back to doing in order to basically make sure that our classes get the right implementation. All right, cool. So what we're going to do now is I'm actually going to type out the classes that we're going to basically use for our forms or for our section and components. So in order to do that, let me just type this out. All right, cool. So what we've basically done here is we've basically now got our two classes that we're going to basically use for holding our components. So we've got our section component class and our form component class. And now if you look at our protocol for our form section item, it now basically has two new properties. So it has an item getter, so you can only get this value, you can't set it or change it once it's been initialized. And what this is going to basically do is it's going to hold our array of items. So I'm just changing that to items. So this is going to actually hold our array of items, which is our form component, and we're basically going to give it a default initializer. So when we basically use this protocol, we have to initialize it with an array of items. Now, why did I use a protocol for this? I could have just literally just typed it out here if I wanted to. Well, the reason why I did this is if I want to basically create like a mock in the future for like unit testing and to unit test the UI and to unit test these components, I now have an implementation within this protocol. So when you're designing a building, components and whatnot, try to think, how can I test this? How can I isolate code and test this in small, sizable chunks? Now the next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to make a change to our form section component first, and then I'll break down what it is that we've done. So let's do that now. All right, cool. So one thing I want to point out before we start to actually break this down from the very top is essentially we now have this keyword here called final. So why did I add final onto this class but not this class below here? So essentially I actually don't want a section component to basically be able to be subclass. I just want the form components to only be allowed to be subclass. So our sections purpose is only to hold our array of form component items. And what you can see here is our class actually now takes on the type of form section item, which is our protocol that we defined here. And it also takes on type hashable. So why does it take on the type hashable? Well, essentially, when you're working with different data sources, it actually needs a hashable object in order to basically figure out what changes were made when you make updates to the data model. Because we've actually used this hashable type now, we're actually able to basically use this class with our different data sources. Now, we've also got the implementation from our protocol with the UUID, the items, as you can see, and also the initializer as well. And we use that to set our items. But we have two new functions here that you may not have come across before. So the first one here is basically a function that automatically comes with hashable. And you basically need to use this so that you can uniquely identify which property you want to use to basically make this object unique. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to basically use our identifier, which is our UUID, so that the hashable protocol can basically uniquely identify each individual section if we had an array of sections. And then finally, we basically have this operator function here, which is basically uses a comparison evaluation to basically check to see if the left hand side component is the same as the right hand side component. So essentially what these two functions are doing here is they basically allow UI differential data source to basically figure out whether an item has changed or if it's the same item as before. So you want to keep that in mind. All right, cool. So the next thing we need to do is we need to actually change our form component and actually add in some code here with the protocol. So let's do that now. Cool. And as you can see here, we now have our home component and it has pretty much the exact same implementation as our section in terms of the hasher, in terms of what we're going to use to uniquely identify our object, and also the comparison to check to see if the objects are the same. All right, cool. So now the next thing we need to do is from the previous breakdown that we discussed before, we actually now need to start actually building our text, our date, and our button component. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to basically go through each one and then we'll break down each one. So the first one we're going to tackle is our text component. So let's do that now. Cool. So now we have our first component here. So let's break this down. So essentially what I've done is I've actually marked this as final. So the reason why I've marked this as final is because I don't want any of the class to be able to subclass this text form component. And it's of type form component using our class from above here. And what we basically and what we're basically doing is we basically have two properties here. So we basically have a placeholder. So this is the placeholder that we're going to show in the text field. And we basically have this property here called keyboard type, which is basically a property for us to define the keyboard type. So in order to use this type, you need to make sure at the top that you import UIKit. And now if we just look at our initializer, we basically have a placeholder, which is type string, and a keyboard type, but we also give it a default, value of dot default, so it's just a default keyboard. So you don't have to define a value in this parameter if you don't want to. And by doing this, you can basically get the default keyboard, or you can specify any other type of keyboard that UI keyboard type offers. Now, the next thing we need to do is we need to actually tackle our date component. So let's do that next. All right, cool. And if you look at our date component, it's a very similar style. So we basically have our mode for the date picker. So what type of mode do you want? And we basically just assign that here. We mark it final again, and it's a type form component. So I hope you're starting to see a pattern here. So essentially, what we're basically saying to our model is we basically want our model to basically be our configuration for our component. So in our cell, when we get onto it in a bit, we don't actually define any type of hard-coded, configuration unless we need to. But most of our configuration is handled within the model. Now, the final component we need to build is our button one. So let's do that now. All right, sweet. And similarly, again, you can see here, we have the title, and we basically use that to basically set our title for our component. So because all of our components are of type So they're all subclasses to type form component. This is what's going to allow us to basically build a dynamic array of these components. So that's what we're going to do in the next bit. So let's do that now. What we need to do is we need to actually go into our side panel here and we need to basically create a new, I'm just going to basically just call this group something like form content for now. And then within this folder, we're actually going to create a new class. So let's create this new class. And we're just going to call this form content builder implementation. So impl. All right, cool. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to just basically build out the model for our form and then break it down. So let me just do that now. All right, cool. Now, before I get started, there's actually two things I've noticed. So I forgot to put the word form in these two components. So I'm just going to right click on this and then choose refactor and then rename. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to basically change this to date form component. And I'm also going to do the same with the button. So rename this to button form component. All right, cool. So what we have here is we basically have our content, and what our content is, it's an array of form section components. So essentially, you can basically have different sections within this array of, components. And what we basically have is we have one section here, which has an array of items, and within the items, we basically have our first name text form component, we have our last name and our email. But notice how on the email it has a keyboard type, so we can actually specify for our email we actually want this to specifically use the email address keyboard type. And then finally as well, we basically have our date form component, and the mode for this is date because I don't want the date and the time, I just want the date. And then at the end, we basically have our button form component, which basically has the title of confirm. So as you can see here, just by looking at this model, you basically have defined how it is that you want your form to be built. And if you were to build more components like we discussed before, or want to add new components, you can basically define it in this array here. So what we need to do now is we actually need to actually build the UI that's going to basically hold these different types of components. So let's actually build our collection view cells now. So what I actually need to do is we actually need to build 3 cells. So we need to build a cell for our text, a cell for our date, and a cell for our button. But before we build these cells, I'm actually going to basically build some handy extensions that will basically help speed up the development of these cells. So what I want to do is I want to basically create a folder here and just create a new group and just call it extensions. And then this folder is going to hold 2 extensions files that we're going to basically build. So the first one is going to basically be called UI collection view identifier. All right, cool. So let's just break down what this extension is doing. So the first thing we've done is we've imported UI kit because we need to do that so we can create an extension on our UI collection view cell. And we basically created a static computer property called cell ID, which is of type string. So what this is actually doing is this will actually basically get the class name and it'll actually automatically turn it into a string for us. Now, why is this useful? So when you're basically defining your cells in a collection view, if you work with it, or a table view, you need to basically define the unique identifier for a cell. Now, I personally don't want to be typing this out all the time. So this handy extension is what we're going to basically use to just basically create a identifier based off the class that we basically use for a given cell. Now, the next extension that we're actually going to build is to basically help us with removing our cells in prepare for reuse. So let's create another file called UI collection view cell plus cleanup. All right, cool. And what we basically got now is a similar thing where we import UI kit. We've got an extension on our UI collection view cell. And we've now got a function where in prepare for reuse, when we need to actually clean up our cell to make sure that we don't have any, leftover views from when they get reused, we basically get the content view, get all the subviews within the content view, loop through them using this high order function, and essentially just remove them from the super view so they don't exist anymore. Now, if you're someone who's new to extensions, you might realize that there's a pattern I've been using. So there's like a plus button. So essentially, when you're working with extensions, you want to basically define the type first. So our type here is UI collection view cell, or if it was a string, it'd be string plus the action. So the action in our case is to actually clean it up. So that's why we said UI collection view cell plus cleanup. All right. So the next thing we're going to do now is we're actually going to basically start to build our cells. And the first cell we're going to build is our button collection view cell. So let's do that now. Let's create a new folder here called collection view cells. And within this, we're going to create a new Cocoa Touch file. You just go to new file and then you go to Cocoa, you can never say that, man. Cocoa Touch class. And then the subclass here is going to be UI collection view cell. And then for the class name, we're just going to call this form button collection view cell. So next, and then we're just going to create that. All right, cool. Right, cool. So let's just break this down. Essentially, what we basically have here is in our cell, we basically have our action button. So this is the button that you're going to basically see on the screen within our cell. And we basically just create a computed, like lazy initialization, just to basically help this run quicker at runtime. And essentially, what this is going to do inside of the initialization is just basically create a button and add some styles. We also have a function here called bind. So what this bind function's purpose is to basically set up our view from the array of the item from our section. So when we actually pass in our item from our section, it will actually go into this function and it will actually go into the setup function. And this is what we're going to use later in the next bit when we start typing again to basically set up and do some configuration with our view. So you'll notice here in the guard that we basically cast it as a button form component. And we're actually able to, pass in a form component because if you remember, we basically subclass form component here. This is what I was saying before that we can basically create an array of dynamic components because they all are the subclass of, form component. And then essentially we just pass that into our item here. And then we basically just use the cells prepare for reuse and use our extension function from before to basically just remove any views whilst the cell, relays itself out. So we do any cleanup. All right, cool. So the next thing we need to do is in our setup, we actually just need to type out a bit of code. So let's do that again and then break it down. All right, cool. So in our setup function, what we're going to basically do is we're basically going to set the title based on the title property from our button form component. So this is what I was talking about before when I was basically saying that the model is what we use to basically define the implementation for our views. So if I just go into our form content build implementation, you'll see here that we basically define the title that we want for our button. All right, cool. And then essentially what we then do is we just basically do some auto layout and adding it into the content view. So we pin it to all the edges in the view. But we do one interesting thing here. So we basically add a height of 44 to the button. Now, the reason why we do this is because I actually want this to basically be like a self-sizing cell. So it automatically, sizes itself based on the content within it. And we'll basically go a bit deeper into this number and why we've done this again when we actually get to the compositional layout section. The next component we need to set up is our text cell. So same again, in this folder, we're going to basically create a new Cocoa Touch class again, and it's just going to basically be a form text collection view cell this time. All right, cool. So now we finished doing that. Now, again, we basically repeated ourselves a bit. So, but this time we now have a text field that we basically set up with the styles and whatnot. Now, I know that you could basically define a rounded rect style on this text field, but I want to control the corner radius and border width and color. So that's why I'm using these three properties. So again, we have a bind function. Now, you're probably realizing that we actually could probably move this into a protocol because we're actually repeating ourselves. But for the sake of this video, I don't want to spend too much time on that. And I just want to keep it as simple as possible. So what we basically do is similar again. We just basically get the item and then just basically cast it as a text form component, pass that into our setup function. And within our setup function, we basically just apply the placeholder from our text form components property and as well as a keyboard type on our text field as well. And then similarly, again, we basically just add in some auto layout so we can basically apply some self-sizing. So now we have one final component that we need to build, which is our date of birth one. So let's do that now. All right, cool. And similarly again, same thing, except this time we have a date picker and we go into our setup. We just basically do our configuration based on our model, except this time for the date picker, we don't actually specify a height because by default it already has a height. So all we need to do is just basically pin it to the edges. All right, cool. So now the next thing we need to do is we actually need to basically build up our compositional layout, which is what we're going to basically use to build up and size each one of the elements within our collection view cells. So we're basically going to aim for a layout which is basically self-sizing. So let's do that now. So let's create a new folder called layout. And then we're going to basically just create a new file called form compositional layout. So Swift file. And just before we get started, we're actually going to basically break down what a compositional layout is. So let's do that now. All right, cool. So before we actually dive into compositional layouts, I thought it'd be a good, time to actually take some time out and actually break down how a compositional layout works because there's quite a lot going on. So this is actually an image that I've taken from the Apple developer documentation, and I put a link to it on the screen as you can see here, and I'll also put it in the description box as well. But essentially, when you're working with compositional layouts, there's three types of components within a compositional layout. So the first type that you normally get is item. So as you can see on the left hand side with the views that are in pink, essentially an item is like your cell. So this is basically your cell where you would do your configuration and you style all your components and whatnot. So this is the component. So around the item, you essentially have a group. So a group is basically a wrapper around this component that basically acts as a container, for the item. So if you want to add spacing around the item, you can basically do that with the group. Now, that's not to say that you can't do it with an item, but a group basically allows you to isolate each item. And then outside of the group, you basically have a section. So a section is a wrapper around the groups of components. So this holds all the groups and it basically allows you to define different sections with groups within them. So it's really important that when you're working with compositional layouts that you basically look at your UI, break it down and see where you need to apply spacing between your item group and your sections. So now that we've broken this down, we're actually going to jump into the code and actually see how we can apply this to our form. All right, cool. So now that we've broken that down, let's actually type this out. So I'm just going to basically type final class. All right, cool. So don't worry about the error because we've actually not finished doing this. So I want to basically just break this down when we go through the item group and then the section. So let's just look at our item here. So what we basically defined is we basically defined a NS collection layout size, and we basically said that we want the size of this, so the width to be a fractional width of 1. So essentially what this means is we want this to basically span the whole screen, so it will basically be 100%. And we basically said that we want the estimated height to be a minimum height essentially of 44. So this is why we specify 44 before, because we want the minimum height of the cell to be 44. And then what we do is we basically initialize our item size within an NS collection layout item. So this is our layout for our item that we've initialized. And then now we can actually apply some changes onto this item. So what we're doing is we're actually adding space into the top and the bottom of the item. So the next thing we need to do now is actually define our group. So let's do that now. All right, cool. So essentially what we basically said here is we basically want to have a group, and our group is basically going to wrap around our item in our, compositional layout. And again, the group's got to have a width of 100, so it's going to fill the whole screen as well. And it's also going to have the same size as our item, so it basically just wraps around it. And what we basically specified here on the next line on layout group is we basically said that we wanted to have a vertical layout, so it's vertical going down, and we basically want the size of it to be this. We want the layout, so sub items to basically be our items. So this is where we basically pass our items, configuration into our group. And we basically define a count of 1. So essentially, this is like you basically saying that you just only want to have like one column within a group, because a group can have multiple columns, but we only want one. And then what we're basically doing here is we're basically saying that we want to apply some insets on our group, so it pushes from the left and the right hand side, so we get the space in between the edges. All right, cool. So now the final thing we need to set up is our section, so let's do that now. All right, cool. So this is the last bit that we need to do, and essentially what we've basically done now is we created an NS collection layout section, and we basically passed in our group to our section. We've applied a content inset onto our section from the top. So what we're basically saying is we want our section to basically have spacing from the top to basically push it down. and then we basically define our UI collection view compositional layout and return this within our computed property. So when you're basically building compositional layouts, you want to essentially like break them up and think about how it is you want to basically lay this out. Now, this is a very simple example, I'm not gonna lie. So I actually do have a video planned where we actually build a more complex layout with more columns and more nested, content. So if you're interested in that video that's basically coming up, make sure that you subscribe to the channel and click the bell for notification updates. So the next thing we want to do now is actually set up our view controller and actually start to bring this all together with the diffable data source. So let's do that now. All right, cool. So now let's go into our view controller and let's basically create an initialization of our compositional layout and our form content builder. So in our view controller, I'm just gonna basically go here and just type this out. All right, cool. So you now created our lazy initialization of our form content builder and our form compositional layout. The next thing we need to do is we actually need to basically create our collection view cell. So I'm just going to type this out and then, as usual, break it down. All right, cool. And as you can see, we basically have our lazy initialization of our collection view. Let's clean this up a bit. And we basically do some styles, but like I mentioned before, we now have this static property where based on the class type, we automatically just basically get a cell identifier with this extension for free. So we don't need to basically track our cell identifiers in a constant file. We just basically just convert the class name into a string. All right. So now we need to actually write out some code to actually lay out our collection view within our view controller. So let's do that now. Right, cool. So now we're basically using load view because I prefer to actually, lay out the components in load view. It's just more efficient. And in our setup function, we basically set the background color for our view controller, add the collection view and just basically pin it to all the edges on the view. All right, cool. So now we're actually ready to actually set up our different data sources within our, view controller. So let's do that now. So when you're working with different data sources, the first thing that you need to basically, specify is the actual data source. So the data source that we're basically specifying is how we basically want our data to be handled and what cells we actually want to be displayed on the screen. So what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to type out the base implementation of this function and then break it down. So we'll go through it step by step. So just below your setup function, just basically create a new function called cool. So ignore the function for now because we're still going to actually fill this out. But essentially what we're basically saying here is we're basically going to create our data source for our collection view. So we basically use the type UI collection view differable data source because this is a collection view. But what we have here is we basically have two constraints with like two generics. So the way this works is you normally basically have here the unique identifier. So this is the identifier for each component within your differable data source. Now in our case, we're going to basically use this section to basically uniquely identify the components within that section. And then the model, so the object that you basically get back to actually lay out a section in our case is basically going to be form component. So the reason why we can basically use these two like so is because like I mentioned before at the start, these two classes are of type, they're both hashable objects. So differable data source is basically able to figure out the differences in our model and basically change the views on the screen if our model changes. So now the next thing we need to do is we actually need to basically give our differable data source a implementation and return the data source and the cells that we want to configure for it. So let's do that now. Cool. So what we've basically done here is we basically created a UI differable data source here, and we basically pass in our collection view because that's what we want to apply this onto. And now what we get from our UI differable data source is we basically now get automatically for free. We basically get the collection view, we basically get the index path, and we get the item like I specified here before. So that's what we get back in this closure. So what we now have is we basically have this here where we have a switch statement on the item. Now, the reason why we switch on the item is because remember when I mentioned earlier before, we wanted to basically have a dynamic mix and match the array of components. And because we basically have an array of form components, we can now distinguish what type of object we're dealing with here. So this is why we basically check to see, is it a text form component, is it a date form component, or is it a button form component? And depending on the type that we basically get back from the array that we specified before. So if I just get this side by side now, just bear me 1 second. So depending on the type that we basically have in our array of form components, we'll basically configure our cell depending on that type, as you can see here. So this is a really nice way of basically dynamically building cells based off an array of components. And it is very, very, very scalable. Because if you want to basically have a new type of component, you just basically create the model, and then basically just create your cell and just add it into the list here. Now we actually could take this one step further if we wanted to, and actually, like I said before, use protocol so we can actually turn this into a one-liner. But I want to keep this video simple for everyone, so they can kind of follow along, because this is kind of like an intermediate going on to an advanced topic. So as you can see, on each one of our cells, we basically just dequeue them, and we just basically bind the item, so our form component, just basically bind it to our cell, and then our cell will basically handle casting it to the correct type and doing its layout. All right, cool. So if you just go up to the top here, we actually need to create a private lazy initialization of our data source so that we can use this on our collection view. Cool. And now that we do initialize it at the top, we're actually able to now use this on our collection view. So let's just do it below when we set the background color. Cool. So now that we've done this, we've actually not finished. So when you're working with different data sources, you do obviously have to define the way you want your data source to be handled, but you also need to actually handle the snapshot. So what a snapshot is basically like the model for the differable data source. So at that time, these are the items that our differable data source has. So what we need to do is we actually need to basically loop through our content builder and actually build a snapshot to actually provide this to our data source. So our data source can then lay out the components from that snapshot. So let's type this out now. All right, cool. So as you can see here, we have a function called update data source, and I basically give it a property here of animated bool, and it's false. Now, what I'm basically doing is on the main thread, I'm going to basically update this snapshot because I want to always ensure that the model gets configured on the main thread and not the any other threads. And I basically made sure that I've marked this as weak because I don't want to basically create a retain cycle within this closure here. So what we're basically doing here is essentially we're just going to basically create a differable data source snapshot. So this is basically like the model of the data, like I said before, for our differable data source. And we're basically going to basically get our sections out of our content array, so our form sections. And we're basically going to append our sections. So this append sections is expecting an array of form section components because that's what we defined here as our identifier for our sections in our differable data source snapshot. And then what we're going to basically do is we're going to loop through each one of our sections using a high order function, and we're actually going to append our items within our section, so our items or our array of form components to the section that you're currently on. So this is going to basically loop through all the sections, get the items and apply it to that section. So if we had two sections, it will basically do it for two of the sections. And then finally, when we finish doing that, we apply the snapshot onto the data source that we applied at the top a second ago. And then we can actually animate whether we want to see the changes or not. Now, by default, I've specified this as false because I want to run this in load view. But if you want to basically refresh this every single time, you would obviously set this to true. All right, cool. So now what we need to do is we actually need to use this in our load view. So if we just scroll up to our load view, underneath the setup, we actually want to update data source, and that's it. All right, cool. So we've actually done a lot here with our differable data source and also our compositional layout. So One thing that I didn't cover too much is on our UI collection view, you'll actually notice as well that you need to specify a collection view layout, and we actually pass in our form component. So this is our compositional layout actually gets passed into our collection view. So at this point, this is where you basically specify the compositional layout that you want your collection view to use. So you can see here that in order to get this working, you need to basically make sure that you specify your compositional layout and you also set up your differable data source with your collection view. All right, cool. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to test this out and run it to see what we get. So I'm just going to choose my favorite simulator, which is the iPhone 11. They'll ask me why. All right, cool. And as you can see, we basically have our form with our text fields, which are actually built off our model. So if I actually go into our form content builder, you'll see that it actually matches our model and it also matches the configurations that we passed in. And you'll basically see that we now have a dynamic array of components based here. So let's say, for example, if I want to add in a new text field here to basically get the user occupation, all I would have to do is just copy this text form component and then paste it below the email address. And I can just basically put in the placeholder here, I can never say that, occupation, run that. And you can see we now automatically get the occupant. I need to learn how to say this word properly. We now get the occupation now added into our form dynamically, easily for free. We didn't need to do anything. We just had to change an array. All right, cool. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. And if you have any feedback in terms of the way that I did this video, or if you have any ideas that you would like to also learn, because I can basically research it and look into it for you, then leave a comment in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate if you give it a thumbs up. And also as well, to help the channel grow, I'd really appreciate if you subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you get updates whenever I release a new video. That's everything from me. I'll catch you all in a bit. Deuces.